Does it help to have someone to talk to?
My mother always and put on a happy face to bring laughter and joy to the world. Or is it getting crazier out there?
They can smile, even in the sky. You'll get through your fear and sorrow. You'll find that life is.
What kind of coward would do something that cold-blooded?
I used to.
What if the world's most dangerous villain was created by society itself? Today we are diving into Joker 2019, the dark story, shocking facts, and hidden details you may have missed. Watch till the end with Sonu Hub and discover what really made Arthur Fleck become the Joker. Joker is a 2019 American psychological thriller movie directed by Todd Phillips, who also helped write the screenplay with Scott Silver. The movie is based on characters from DC Comics and stars Joaquin Phoenix in the lead role. Instead of telling the same old story, it gives fans a different take on how the Joker came to be. The movie follows Arthur Fleck, a struggling man dealing with serious mental health problems, who works as a party clown and dreams of becoming a stand-up comedian. As life keeps beating him down and people treat him like he doesn't matter, Arthur slowly loses his grip on reality. His fall into a darker way of thinking ends up starting a violent uprising against the rich people in a rundown and broken Gotham City. Robert De Niro, Zazie Beetz, and Francis Conroy also appear in important supporting roles. Todd Phillips first came up with the idea for Joker in 2016, and he worked with Scott Silver on the script during 2017. They took a lot of inspiration from character-focused movies made in the 1970s and from films directed by Martin Scorsese. Movies like Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy had a big influence on the story and the overall feel of Joker. Martin Scorsese was even connected to the project as a producer early on. The movie also borrows a few ideas from comic book stories like Batman, The Killing Joke, and The Dark Knight Returns, but Phillips and Silver didn't want to copy any one comic book. They also wanted the movie to stand on its own instead of being tied to the storylines from earlier Batman movies. Joaquin Phoenix became interested in playing the Joker in early 2018 and officially got the role that summer. Most of the rest of the cast joined the movie by August. Filming took place in New York City, Jersey City, and Newark, New Jersey. From September through December of 2018, the movie was shot in real city locations to give Gotham a rough, gritty, and believable look. Joker also made history because it was the first live-action Batman movie released in theaters to receive an R rating from the Motion Picture Association, mainly because of its mature themes, violence, and disturbing subject matter. Joker had its first big screening at the Venice International Film Festival on August 31, 2019. It ended up winning the festival's top prize, the Golden Lion, which was a huge deal for a comic book movie. Warner Brothers Pictures released the movie in theaters across the United States on October 4, 2019. Critics had mixed feelings about the movie, with some loving its dark style and others not being as impressed with the story. However, almost everyone agreed that Joaquin Phoenix gave an incredible performance. His acting was praised as powerful, emotional, and completely unforgettable. The movie turned into a massive box office hit. It broke records for movies released in October and made more than $1 billion around the world. That made Joker the first R-rated movie in history to cross the $1 billion mark at the worldwide box office. For several years, it was also the highest grossing R-rated movie ever made until Deadpool and Wolverine passed its record in 2024. The movie received 11 nominations at the 92nd Academy Awards and won 2 Oscars. Joaquin Phoenix won Best Actor for his amazing performance, and the movie also won Best Original Score for its haunting music. On top of that, Joker picked up many other awards and honors from different film organizations around the world. A sequel called Joker Folie à Deux was released in 2024. Unlike the first movie, the sequel didn't connect with critics or audiences. The same way, it received mostly negative reviews and struggled at the box office, making it a major disappointment compared to the huge success of the original Joker movie. The casting of Joaquin Phoenix as Arthur Fleck, Joker Todd Phillips conceived the project with Joaquin Phoenix specifically in mind from the earliest stages of development. Phillips and co-writer Scott Silver crafted the screenplay around the actor's particular strengths, his capacity for vulnerability mixed with unpredictability, his history of immersive physical transformations, and an inherent sense of chaos that Phillips felt aligned with the character of Arthur Fleck. Phillips has described Phoenix as someone who seemed like an agent of chaos, and he viewed the role as something that would introduce a comic book figure into the actor's cinematic universe rather than the reverse. Rumors circulated at various points that Leonardo DiCaprio or others might have been under consideration, but Phillips has been consistent in stating that the film's written for Phoenix and that no serious alternatives were pursued once the idea crystallized. Phoenix approached the material with significant hesitation. He had long resisted comic book or superhero adjacent projects, viewing them as outside his preferred range of character-driven work. He had previously been approached for roles in the genre, including interest around Doctor Strange, but had declined. When Phillips first brought the Joker script to him, Phoenix was not immediately receptive to the idea of jumping into costume. The process of securing his commitment stretched across roughly 3 months of repeated conversations. Phillips visited Phoenix's home multiple times, answering detailed questions about the character's psychology, the tone of the film, and the creative approach. Phoenix later described asking Phillips to come over so that he could essentially audition the director, testing the seriousness of the vision. Phillips recalled that Phoenix never delivered a formal yes. The attachment became real when Phoenix simply appeared at a wardrobe fitting one day. From that point forward, the collaboration deepened into an unusually fluid partnership in which the actor and director continued to refine the character even after principal photography began. Physical transformation formed a central part of the preparation. Phillips envisioned Arthur as malnourished, wolf-like, and feral. Phoenix initially preferred a heavier physicality for the character, but ultimately agreed to a severe weight loss of approximately 52 pounds. He trained with a choreographer, studied movement and dance references, keeping specific names private, and worked extensively on the signature laugh that becomes both a symptom and a weapon. The laugh itself was rehearsed in private sessions with Phillips long before cameras rolled. Phoenix also kept a journal in character, filling pages with drawings, writing, and repetitions that later influenced on set ideas. The character continued to evolve during production. Phoenix has spoken of radical adjustments several weeks into shooting after early approaches felt wrong in appearance, behavior, and energy. The collaborative atmosphere allowed for on the fly rewriting of scenes, with Phillips and the actor sometimes crafting material in the trailer immediately before filming. Phoenix exerted influence beyond his own performance. He established a clear preference for the supporting ensemble. Strong actors who would not disrupt the delicate atmosphere required for such an intense interior story. Josh Pace, who plays Hoyt Vaughn, Arthur's boss at the clown agency, has recounted that Phillips relayed Phoenix's directive almost verbatim during the hiring process. After reviewing Pace's audition, Phillips told him the tape was strong, but that the production needed to ensure no one would ruin the whole vibe. Phoenix's instruction, as relayed, was straightforward: cast good actors and no assholes. This rule shaped the tone of the set and filtered into the selection of many supporting players. The result was an ensemble of experienced character actors and emerging talents who could hold the frame opposite Phoenix without competing for attention or introducing unnecessary friction. Robert De Niro as Mari Franklin. Robert De Niro was approached after the script had been completed. Phillips met with him in an office setting and discussed the role of the late-night talk show host Murray Franklin. De Niro accepted, bringing with him decades of association with the very films that inspired joke, particularly Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. In those earlier works, De Niro had played Rupert Pupkin, an aspiring comedian obsessed with a talk show host, and Travis Bickle, an isolate outsider descending into violence. Casting him as the swa-cutting host who ultimately humiliates Arthur created a deliberate inversion and intertextual layer. De Niro's presence also lent the production immediate prestige and grounded the film's 1970s, 1980s aesthetic in authentic New York cinematic history. The character of Murray becomes both a mentor figure in Arthur's fantasies and the ultimate catalyst for public violence, and De Niro's measured, charismatic delivery provided the necessary contrast to Phoenix's unraveling intensity. Zazie Beetz as Sophie Dumont. Zazie Beetz was cast as Sophie Dumont, the single mother living in the same building as Arthur and the object of his imagined romantic connection. Beetz has described receiving the script through her agency and initially assuming it would be a conventional comic book entry. Upon reading it, she became determined to secure the part. She auditioned in person, felt she had not delivered her strongest work, and later submitted a second self-tape. That tape led to a chemistry read with Phoenix. Beetz has spoken of being nervous. Phoenix, still finding Arthur, admitted his own nerves, which helped put her at ease. The process stretched over a couple of months before she was officially attached on set. Beetz observed the unusually fluid creative process in which scenes were rewritten and sometimes reshot weeks later because of Phoenix's physical transformation and the ongoing discovery of the character. Sophie functions as one of the few points of genuine human contact in Arthur's life, and Beetz is grounded. Understated performance supplies both warmth and eventual horror when the true nature of their relationship is revealed. Frances Conroy as Penny Fleck. Frances Conroy was cast as Penny Fleck, Arthur's ailing, delusional mother. After Frances McDormand declined the role, Conroy brought a long resume of complex maternal and psychologically layered performances, most notably in 6 Feet Under and American Horror Story. Penny is simultaneously a source of Arthur's fragile sense of identity and a repository of buried trauma and fabricated history involving the Wayne family. Conroy's work emphasizes frailty, dependence, and a quiet instability that mirrors and amplifies her son's. She has spoken of Phoenix's complete immersion on set. She felt she was acting opposite Arthur rather than the actor, a testament to the intensity Phoenix maintained. The mother-son relationship forms one of the emotional cores of the film, and Conroy's casting ensured that the domestic scenes carried authentic weight rather than melodrama. Supporting ensemble and character actors Brett Cullen stepped into the role of Thomas Wayne after Alec Baldwin left the project due to scheduling conflicts. Cullen portrays the billionaire industrialist and mayoral candidate as a figure of distant privilege and eventual cold rejection. His scenes with Phoenix crystallize Arthur's class resentment and personal delusion. Douglas Hodge appears as Alfred Pennyworth, the Wayne family butler, in a brief but pointed confrontation that further distances Arthur from any claim on the Wayne household. Dante Pereira Rosen plays the young Bruce Wayne, providing a quiet, observant counterpoint in the film's closing sequences. Shea Wiggum and Bill Camp play detectives Burke and Garrity, the pair investigating the subway murders. Both are seasoned character actors known for naturalistic intensity. Their interrogations of Arthur supply, procedural texture, and gradual revelation of Arthur's growing detachment from reality. Glenn Fleshler portrays Randall, one of Arthur's fellow clowns whose betrayal becomes a pivotal act of cruelty. Lee Gill plays Gary, the dwarf colleague who becomes an unexpected witness and survivor of Arthur's violence. Josh Pice, as noted, plays the dismissive agency manager Hoyt Vaughn. Mark Maron appears as Gene Afflan, a producer associated with Murray's show. Sondra James plays Dr. Sally, one of the social workers or medical figures in Arthur's orbit. Murphy Geyer appears as Barry O'Donnell. Sharon Washington plays the social worker who interacts with Arthur early in the story. Hannah Gross portrays a younger version of Penny in flashback material. Frank Wood appears as Dr. Stoner. Brian Tyree Henry has a small role as Carl, an Arkham clerk. April Grace plays an Arkham psychiatrist. Additional performers populate the world of Gotham, The Wall Street Three, Carl Lundstedt, Michael Bann's Ben Warhite, who assault Arthur on the subway, various comics essays at the Open Mic Nights, Gary Gulman, Sam Morrill, Chris Red, street kids, protesters, clown colleagues, news anchors, and hospital staff. Rocco Luna plays Sophie's daughter Gigi. Carrie Louise Putrello appears as Martha Wayne. These roles, though often brief, were filled with actors capable of creating textured, lived-in presence within the film's carefully controlled frames. Casting process and production atmosphere. Casting director Shayna Markowitz oversaw the assembly of the ensemble. The production operated with a deliberate emphasis on atmosphere, because Phoenix's performance required sustained intensity, and because the film was approached in the spirit of an independent character study rather than a conventional studio tentpole. The set needed collaborators who could match that focus. The no assholes guideline was not merely anecdotal. It reflected a practical understanding that interpersonal friction could derail the delicate tone Phillips and Phoenix were constructing. auditions for many supporting roles used sides that did not reveal the full script, protecting the project's secrecy while still allowing evaluation of the actor's instincts. The collaborative rewriting process described by Beetz and others meant that casting choices had to favor performers comfortable with fluidity. Actors needed the ability to absorb new material quickly, respond to Phoenix's improvisational energy, and maintain consistency across reshoots necessitated by the star's physical transformation. Phoenix's weight loss created a practical constraint. Certain sequences had to be captured within a limited window before his body changed further, accelerating the creative cycle. Intertextual and thematic considerations in casting. The selection of De Niro deliberately invoked the Scorsese films that informed the screenplay's DNA. Phoenix's own filmography, ranging from The Master and You Were Never Really Here to earlier transformative work, signaled that the project would prioritize psychological realism and physical commitment over comic book spectacle. Beetz's rising profile from Atlanta and Deadpool 2 brought a contemporary naturalism. Conroy's television and film resume supplied maternal complexity without sentimentality. The supporting ranks were filled with actors experienced in independent and character-driven cinema, ensuring that even the smallest roles felt specific rather than generic. Phillips has emphasized that the entire narrative is filtered through Arthur's unreliable perspective. Casting choices therefore needed to support that subjectivity. Performers who could appear differently depending on whether a scene was rooted in reality or in Arthur's projection. Sophie's casting is especially sensitive in this regard. Beetz's performance must sustain both the warmth Arthur perceives and the eventual revelation of distance or fabrication. Physical and behavioral preparation across the cast. While Phoenix's transformation was the most extreme, other actors calibrated their work to the film's 1981 Gotham setting and its social texture. Costume designer Mark Bridges, production designer Mark Friedberg, and the makeup and hair departments created a cohesive visual world that the actors inhabited. Movement, posture, and vocal quality were adjusted to period and class markers. Phoenix's choreography work influenced the physical language of the film. Supporting players responded in kind during shared scenes. The intensity of Phoenix's process occasionally affected the set dynamic. Reports describe him walking out of takes when the energy felt wrong, an approach that required patience and professionalism from scene partners. The good actor, no asshole filter helped ensure that the ensemble could absorb those moments without personal conflict. De Niro and Phoenix's professional relationship, while occasionally described as having tension in character work, remained functional and productive for the material. Broader ensemble texture beyond the principal supporting players. The film relies on a large number of day players and background performers to populate Gotham streets, the comedy club, the television studio, the subway, Arkham, and the climactic riot sequences. Casting these roles with care contributed to the film's sense of a lived-in, decaying city. Faces that appear only briefly still register as specific individuals rather than anonymous extras. This attention to detail in the lower tiers of the cast list reinforces the thematic concern with overlooked people and the social conditions that produce isolation and rage. The overall casting strategy rejected the notion of assembling a conventional blockbuster ensemble. Instead, it prioritized actors whose previous work suggested an ability to disappear into damaged, ordinary, or quietly menacing figures. The result is a film in which every performance, from Phoenix's central tour de force to the smallest interaction feels of a piece. With the same grim, intimate vision, Phillips's insistence on Phoenix as the irreplaceable center, combined with a supporting cast selected for skill, professionalism, and atmospheric compatibility, produced the specific alchemy that defines the finished film. Details of individual casting timelines and decisions Phoenix's attachment was secured through persistence rather than a single decisive meeting. Phillips has described the process as one of continuous conversation rather than negotiation. Once Phoenix was on board, the supporting roles filled relatively quickly in the months leading into production. Beetz's multi-stage audition process, in-person self-tape chemistry illustrates the care taken with roles that would share significant screen time with the lead. Conroy's casting followed the decline of another high-profile actress, demonstrating that the production was willing to wait for the right presence rather than settle. Cullen's late replacement of Baldwin shows the practical side of scheduling on a film that still maintained high standards for every role. Pace's experience is representative of the mid-level casting process. An initial audition with casting directors' enthusiasm for the tape, a personal meeting with Phillips that included the Phoenix rule, and then confirmation. Similar pathways applied to many of the character actors. The production's independent film sensibility, even under a major studio banner, allowed for this level of personal evaluation rather than pure star packaging. The role of chemistry and collaborative discovery chemistry reads with Phoenix were decisive for key supporting parts. Beetz has described the nervous energy of reading. Opposite an actor still discovering the character, that shared vulnerability became part of the working relationship. On set, the discovery continued. Phoenix has noted that major reconceptions of Arthur's behavior, appearance, and energy occurred mid-shoot after particular sequences clarified what was working and what was not. Supporting actors had to remain flexible enough to accommodate those shifts. The willingness of the ensemble to operate in this mode of continuous refinement is itself a product of careful casting. Legacy of the casting choices. Within the film's reception, although the article focuses on the process rather than reception, the casting decisions directly shaped what audiences experienced. Phoenix's physical and emotional commitment became the film's primary talking point and awards narrative. De Niro's presence activated intertextual readings. Beetz, Conroy, and the supporting players provided the human texture against which Arthur's isolation registers. The absence of conventional comic book casting tropes. No established franchise stars in heroic roles, no self-referential cameos reinforce the film's identity as a character study first. The casting of Joker ultimately reflects a coherent artistic strategy, place an actor of Phoenix's intensity and unpredictability at the absolute center, surround him with skilled professionals who will not dilute that intensity, and allow the collaborative process the freedom to evolve. Every major and minor role was filled with that priority in mind. The result is an ensemble that serves the singular vision of Arthur Fleck's descent without distraction or dilution. From the months-long pursuit of Phoenix to the application of a simple professional standard for the rest of the company, the casting process was as deliberate and character-driven as the film itself. Production, development, and pre-production. The road to Joker began years before cameras ever rolled, and it started not with a studio mandate but with an actor's private curiosity. Sometime between 2014 and 2015, Joaquin Phoenix mentioned to his agent that he would be interested in a stripped-down, low-budget character study built around a comic book villain, something closer in spirit to a psychological drama than a traditional superhero blockbuster. He specifically raised the idea of tackling a figure like the Joker, the DC Comics antagonist most associated with Batman. At that stage, though, it was little more than a passing thought rather than a concrete plan, and it would take director Todd Phillips' own pitch in 2016 for the idea to gain real traction. Interestingly, Phoenix's first instinct was actually to talk himself out of it. He reasoned that the Joker was too well trodden a character, one that had already been done by other notable performers, and he tried to conceive of a different comic book figure to build his character study around. His agent floated the notion of setting up an exploratory conversation with Warner Bros. But Phoenix declined and shelved the idea for the time being. Phoenix had also previously turned down opportunities within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, largely because those roles, such as Bruce Banner Hulk, a part played by Edward Norton before Mark Ruffalo took over, or Stephen Strange, Doctor Strange, ultimately played by Benedict Cumberbatch, would have required him to commit to reprising the same character across multiple films, a type of long-term franchise commitment that did not appeal to him. Around the same period, Todd Phillips had separately been approached numerous times about directing comic book movies and had consistently said no, feeling that the genre's films tended to be, in his own estimation, too loud and not particularly interesting to him personally. What changed his calculus was the idea of making a different kind of comic book film altogether, something more grounded, more intimate, and rooted in the tradition of gritty character studies rather than spectacle driven blockbusters. Phillips was drawn specifically to the Joker because, in his view, no single performance or film had yet delivered what he considered a definitive take on the character, which meant there was considerable room for creative interpretation without being bound by expectations tied to a canonical portrayal. Phillips brought his pitch to Warner Brothers in August 2016, shortly after the premiere of his film War Dogs. Before that project, Phillips had built his reputation primarily on comedies, titles such as Road Trip 2000, Old School 2003, and The Hangover 2009, and War Dogs represented his first meaningful step into darker, more unsettling territory. By his own account, the muted reception to War Dogs at its premiere prompted a moment of reflection. He began to wonder what audiences actually wanted to see, sensing that the film wasn't going to set the world on fire. Compounding this, he had also found it increasingly difficult to make traditional comedies given the cultural climate at the time, describing friction with a vocal segment of critics on social media. Out of that frustration came the idea of taking the comic book movie framework, a genre then dominated by high gloss, tentpole filmmaking, and inverting its usual conventions entirely. Phillips subsequently proposed that Warner Bros. Fledgling DC Films slate differentiate itself from the rival Marvel Studios by pursuing lower budget standalone projects that did not need to slot into an ongoing shared continuity. This pitch landed at an opportune moment. Following the box office and critical success of Wonder Woman, in 2017, DC Films had already begun to reconsider its approach, moving away from an insistence on a tightly interconnected shared universe akin to the DC Extended Universe DCEU that had underpinned earlier releases like Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, and Suicide Squad. In August 2017, Warner Brothers and DC Films formally announced the project, confirming that Phillips would direct and co-write the script alongside Scott Silver. with Martin Scorsese attached to co-produce. According to reporting from Tatiana Siegel of The Hollywood Reporter, Scorsese had at one point been considered as a potential director for the film before Phillips was ultimately chosen, though a source close to the studio suggested Scorsese's involvement was as much about needing a producer with deep ties to New York City's filmmaking infrastructure as it was about directorial ambitions. The announcement did not sit well with everyone connected to prior interpretations of the character. Jared Leto, who had played the Joker within the DCEU beginning with Suicide Squad, was reportedly displeased that a separate unconnected version of the character was moving forward. Reporting by Kim Masters and Boris Kitt of The Hollywood Reporter indicated that Leto felt sidelined and upset once he learned that Warner Bros., a studio that had previously promised him a standalone Joker film built around his own portrayal, was allowing Phillips' project to proceed instead. Leto was said to have gone so far as to ask his music manager Irving Azoff to intervene and attempt to get the Phillips film cancelled. Masters further reported that this frustration contributed to Leto's decision to part ways with his talent agency, Creative Artists Agency, as he reportedly felt his representatives should have flagged the competing project earlier and advocated more forcefully on his behalf. Sources aligned with Leto, however, pushed back on the narrative that he had actively tried to have Joker shut down or that this was the reason for his agency split. Casting the lead role proved to be its own extended negotiation. Warner Bros. Initially pushed for Leonardo DiCaprio to play the character, hoping that Scorsese's involvement, given his long collaborative history with DiCaprio, might be the deciding factor in securing him. Phillips, however, maintained that Phoenix had been the only actor he seriously considered for the part from the outset. He and Silver, in fact, wrote the screenplay with Phoenix specifically in mind, with Phillips later summarizing the underlying philosophy behind the project as an effort to bring comic book movies into Phoenix's creative world, rather than the reverse inserting Phoenix into an existing comic book universe. For his part, Phoenix said that once he learned about the project, he grew genuinely excited, feeling that it represented precisely the kind of unconventional non-studio feeling film he had been hoping to make. Even so, it took him considerable time to fully commit, since the role intimidated him. He later explained that comic book properties often lean on simplified, reductive archetypes that let audiences hold characters at arm's length, and he was wary of a film that might similarly distance the audience from Arthur Fleck rather than forcing empathy or discomfort. Phillips has spoken candidly about how arduous the process of actually getting the film greenlit and produced turned out to be, describing roughly a year spent trying to align a new set of studio executives and stakeholders with the vision he had originally pitched to a different team. He recalled receiving pushback rooted in the character's commercial ubiquity. For instance, concerns raised internally about the fact that Joker branded merchandise, including pajamas, was sold in mainstream retail stores like Target, and described having to navigate what he called a zillion hurdles one at a time. While he admitted to private frustration with the obstacles at the time, he later reframed the studio's willingness to proceed with such an unusual R-rated character study as a genuinely bold decision on their part. Phillips and Silver spent all of 2017 writing the screenplay, a process that took roughly a year to complete. Producer Emma Tillinger-Koskoff noted that securing the studio's approval for the finished script took additional time, partly due to lingering concerns about its content. Phillips has emphasized that although the film's underlying themes might resonate with aspects of contemporary society, he did not conceive of the project as a political statement. Instead, he has described Joker first and foremost as a story about childhood trauma and mental illness, noting in interviews how difficult it can be for people living with mental illness to be candid about their diagnoses, a theme distilled in one of the film's key lines about the burden of being expected to behave as though nothing is wrong despite an underlying condition. Stylistically and thematically, the screenplay draws heavily from a lineage of character-driven films from the New Hollywood era, particularly several Martin Scorsese pictures: Taxi Driver 1976, Raging Bull 1980, and The King of Comedy 1982. Phillips has also cited his own earlier work, including the Hangover trilogy, as a stylistic touchstone, along with a broader collection of 1970s character studies such as Serpico 1973 and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest 1975. He has additionally pointed to the 1928 silent film The Man Who Laughs and a range of classic movie musicals as influences. Despite the tonal shift from his prior comedic work, Phillips has said he did not view Joker as fundamentally different in kind from earlier projects like the Hangover films, merely different in tone and register. In terms of source material, the film's basic premise draws inspiration from Alan Moore and Brian Bolland's 1988 graphic novel Batman: The Killing Joke, which portrays the Joker as a comedian who failed to make it as a performer before turning to crime. The climactic sequence, set on a late-night talk show, meanwhile, echoes a similarly staged confrontation found in Frank Miller's 1986 graphic novel The Dark Knight Returns. Beyond these specific touch points, however, Phillips has insisted that the film does not attempt to faithfully follow any particular comic storyline, stating that the project was never meant to retell an existing Joker story, but rather to explore the process of becoming the Joker. He later clarified this stance, explaining that rather than adapting one specific source, the writers picked and chose elements from across the character's long publishing history that suited their purposes. Having grown up in New York, Phillips also drew on his own memories of the city during the early 1980s to inform the film's atmosphere and setting. The subway shooting sequence that serves as a pivotal turning point in the plot was directly inspired by the real-life 1984 New York City subway shooting, and the character of Arthur Fleck partially draws on Bernard Goetz, the perpetrator of that shooting, as source material. When it came to explaining how Arthur ultimately becomes the Joker, Phillips and Silver deliberately avoided leaning on the most widely recognized comic book origin, the character falling into a vat of chemicals and emerging disfigured, regarding that particular explanation as too far-fetched for the grounded, realistic tone they were pursuing. Instead, they opted to draw selectively from existing Joker lore to construct an original narrative that Phillips wanted to feel as psychologically authentic as possible. Because the character has never had one fixed official origin story within the comics, the writers found themselves with unusual creative latitude, which Phillips has described as pushing himself and Silver to conceive of something appropriately unconventional each day of the writing process. Phillips compared the endeavor to any other artistic reinterpretation of a well-known figure, likening it to new theatrical productions of Macbeth. At the same time, the writers wanted to preserve some of the ambiguity that has traditionally defined the character's mysterious past in the comics, so they built the film around an unreliable narrator allowing entire sequences to be understood as possible delusions on Arthur's part, and deliberately left the precise nature of his mental illness unspecified. As a consequence, Phillips has stated that the film as a whole is meant to remain open to audience interpretation. An early complication arose when an April 2018 draft of the screenplay leaked online. Phillips downplayed the significance of the leak, noting that the leaked draft represented an outdated version written roughly 6 months before filming actually began. He also chose not to pursue any legal action over the leak, saying he did not mind that an older draft was circulating publicly behind the scenes at the studio. Executive turnover also played a role in shaping the project's path forward. After the disappointing critical and commercial reception of 2017's Justice League, Walter Hamada took over from John Berg as the head of DC-based film production at Warner Bros. In January 2018. Hamada proceeded to review the various DC projects then in development, cancelling some while allowing others, including Joker, to move ahead, albeit on a comparatively modest budget of around $55 million for a film slated to begin filming later that year. According to Kim Masters reporting for The Hollywood Reporter, the studio was somewhat reluctant to let the project advance and may have deliberately kept its budget small as a way of discouraging Phillips from proceeding. Phillips, for his part, felt that Hamada simply did not fully grasp what he was attempting to accomplish creatively. By June 2018, Robert De Niro had entered discussions for a supporting role in the film. Phoenix's deal was finalized the following month, in July 2018, following roughly 4 months of sustained persuasion from Phillips. Warner Bros. Officially greenlit the project immediately afterward, confirming its title as Joker and setting an October 4, 2019 release date. In its official messaging, the studio described the project as an exploration of a man cast aside by society, framing it as both a gritty character study and a broader cautionary tale. Scorsese's longtime producing partner, Emma Tillinger-Koskoff, came aboard to produce the film, while Scorsese himself ultimately stepped back from his producing role due to other professional commitments, chiefly his work on The Irishman 2019, which also starred De Niro, and left him with limited bandwidth to remain closely involved with Joker. He did briefly consider taking on a lesser executive producer role, but ultimately did not pursue it. The studio also moved to reassure fans and press alike that this new film would have no bearing on Leto's version of the character and would instead launch a new line of DC films entirely separate from the established DCEU continuity. Casting continued to take shape throughout the summer of 2018. Zazie Beetz was cast in a supporting role in July, with De Niro entering formal negotiations the following month. Beetz's path to the role was somewhat unusual. She initially auditioned in person, but was turned down only to later re-audition using a self-recorded tape. That self-tape led to a chemistry read alongside Phoenix, which ultimately secured her the part. Frances McDormand was also considered for the role of Arthur's mother, but turned the offer down, after which Frances Conroy was cast in the part instead. Mark Maron and Brian Colin both joined the cast at the end of July. Alec Baldwin was originally cast as Thomas Wayne on August 27, but exited the production just 2 days later, citing scheduling conflicts. Baldwin also later pointed to the character's written description, reportedly portrayed as a tanned, brashly self-assured businessman evocative of a 1980s-era Donald Trump, as an additional factor in his decision to step away from the role. Filming principal photography began in New York City, in September 2018, initially operating under the working title Romeo to help maintain confidentiality around the production. Shortly after filming commenced, the studio confirmed the additions of De Niro, Brett Cullen, who stepped into the role of Thomas Wayne following Baldwin's departure, Shea Whigham, Glenn Fleshler, Bill Camp, Josh Pace, and Douglas Hodge to the cast. Bradley Cooper also joined the production as a producer, while cinematographer Lawrence Sher, a frequent collaborator of Phillips on his earlier comedies, was brought on as director of photography. On September 22, the production filmed a sequence depicting a violent public protest at the Church Avenue subway station in the Kensington neighborhood of Brooklyn. For the purposes of the film, the station was visually altered to resemble the Bedford Park Boulevard station in the Bronx. Additional scenes involving violence were shot at the disused lower platform of the 9th Avenue station in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. According to Zazie Beetz, significant portions of the screenplay were actually rewritten during production itself, largely because Phoenix's dramatic weight loss for the role made traditional reshoots impractical. Once a scene was filmed, there was little opportunity to revisit it later, given his physical transformation. Beetz recalled a working process in which the cast would gather in Phillips's trailer to write a given scene the night before shooting it, memorize the new material during hair and makeup, perform it, and then move on with limited ability to circle back for further revisions weeks down the line. Phillips has also described how Phoenix would sometimes step away from set entirely during the shoot, needing to regain composure after losing himself in the emotional demands of a scene, behavior that occasionally confused other cast members unfamiliar with his process, who worried they had inadvertently done something wrong. De Niro was reportedly one of the few actors Phoenix never walked away from during a scene together, with De Niro later describing Phoenix's intensity as entirely appropriate to what the role demanded. Filming moved to Jersey City on September 30, temporarily closing down Newark Avenue, with additional filming there in November beginning on November 9, that similarly closed Kennedy Boulevard. A separate stretch of filming took place in Newark from October 13 through October 16. Shortly before the Newark filming, SAG-AFTRA received a complaint alleging that background performers had been kept inside subway cars for more than 3 hours during an earlier Brooklyn shoot, in violation of standard break rules. The matter was resolved fairly quickly after a union representative visited the set to address the issue. That same month, Dante Pereira Olson joined the production as young Bruce Wayne. Around the end of October, Shea Whigham noted that the production was roughly at its midpoint, describing the overall filming experience as both intense and rewarding. By mid-November, filming had shifted back to New York City, and principal photography ultimately wrapped on December 3, 2018, an occasion Phillips later marked with a commemorative post on his Instagram account. Producer Emma Tillinger-Koskoff has singled out the filming of the now famous stair dance sequence, shot on what fans and media have since dubbed the Joker stairs, as one of the most logistically stressful parts of the production. Because New York City lacked strict legal protections against paparazzi at the time, filming at that location was frequently disrupted by photographers attempting to capture unauthorized shots. The production had originally scouted a set of stairs in the South Bronx previously used in the 2007 crime film American Gangster, but according to reporting in the New York Times, those steps had since been repaved and visually refreshed to the point where they no longer suited the gritty aesthetic the filmmakers were after, prompting the crew to find an alternative location instead. On a technical level, Lawrence Sher and Phillips initially hoped to shoot the film on 65mm film stock intended for eventual 70mm theatrical presentation, but Warner Brothers rejected that approach on cost grounds. The production instead shot digitally using ARRI Alexa 65 cameras. Despite the shift away from actual film capture, Warner Brothers ultimately did arrange for a limited theatrical release of the finished film in converted 70mm and 35mm formats, honoring at least part of the filmmaker's original visual ambitions. Post-production Phillips confirmed in March 2019 that he was actively in the editing process on the film. Speaking the following month at the industry event CinemaCon, he described the project as still taking shape and said he found it difficult to discuss publicly, largely because he wanted to preserve an element of surprise for audiences. He also pushed back on many of the reports and rumors circulating about the film at the time, attributing some of the difficulty in discussing it honestly to the fact that it was, in his words, an origin story for a character who has never had one single definitive origin to begin with. It was also confirmed around this period that Brian Tyree Henry had joined the cast. Visual effects work on the film was handled by Scanline VFX and Shade VFX, supervised by Matthew Jampa and Brian Godwin, with Erwin Rivera serving as overall visual effects supervisor. Several scenes were ultimately cut from the finished film. One deleted sequence depicted Sophie watching Arthur's disastrous appearance on Murray Franklin's talk show, a scene intended to signal to audiences that she was still alive, since the released version of the film otherwise strongly implies that Arthur may have killed her. Phillips ultimately decided the scene disrupted the narrative's tight adherence to Arthur's subjective point of view and cut it from the final edit. Another deleted scene involved Arthur confessing his crimes to a co-worker. That sequence was removed because Phillips felt it delivered too much explicit exposition to the audience. According to one account of the production, the original screenplay had actually ended with Arthur carving a Glasgow smile into his own face in front of his gathered supporters, but that idea was reportedly rejected by then Warner Bros. Executive Christopher Nolan, who insisted that the Glasgow smile remain uniquely associated with Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker in Nolan's own 2008 film, The Dark Knight. The completed film carried a final budget estimated between $55 million and $70 million, a figure widely described by outlets such as The Hollywood Reporter as remarkably modest compared to the typical cost of a major comic book adaptation. For context, the previous DC villain-centered film, 2016 Suicide Squad, had cost roughly $175 million to produce. Of Joker's budget, $25 million was covered by the Toronto-based financing company Creative Wealth Media, while Village Roadshow Pictures and Bronze Studios each contributed a quarter of the remaining funds. The finished film also carried the distinction of being the first live-action theatrical entry in the broader Batman film franchise to receive an R rating from the Motion Picture Association, assigned officially for strong bloody violence, disturbing behavior, coarse language, and brief sexual imagery. In the United Kingdom, the British Board of Film Classification issued the film a 15 certificate, citing strong bloody violence and language. Visually, the film's version of Gotham City was conceived as an analog for early 1980s New York City, a choice Phillips has said was made deliberately to distance the film from the broader DC cinematic universe. A production designer, Mark Friedberg, selected a section of Newark, New York, to serve as the film's version of Gotham Square, in part because the area retained visible signs of poverty consistent with the film's tone. Friedberg wanted Gotham to evoke the grimy, decaying urban landscape depicted in Taxi Driver, and to that end he devised an elaborate map of the fictional city, complete with named streets and landmarks, to ground the production design in a coherent sense of place. He also populated the sets with brightly colored 1970s era muscle cars, aiming for a jarring visual contrast that felt simultaneously beautiful and unsettling and reinforced the city's atmosphere of decay through the extensive use of graffiti, litter-strewn streets, and cracked sidewalks. The visual effects team supplemented these physical sets by digitally altering the city's skyline, adding fictional buildings to heighten the sense that Gotham was oppressively closing in on Arthur throughout the story. Cinematographer Lawrence Sher opted to use sodium vapor lighting extensively throughout the film, a stylistic choice intended to visually represent both Arthur's isolation and, at certain points, a more hopeful undercurrent to his character. The fictional Arkham State Hospital seen in the film is a direct reference to the more traditionally named Arkham Asylum from the Batman comics. According to Warner Bros. Career's promotional materials, the state hospital naming convention was chosen to feel more plausible within a grounded, real-world setting. The building's exterior was filmed at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, while interior scenes were shot inside the Metropolitan Hospital Center in Harlem. Eagle-eyed viewers have noted an inconsistency in the depiction of the hospital's interior walls, appearing distinctly white during the film's opening and closing scenes, but a ginger yellow during an earlier sequence in which Arthur reads a confidential medical file. This visual discrepancy was reportedly an intentional choice meant to sow doubt in the audience's mind about whether Arthur might have been institutionalized at Arkham for the entirety of the story being depicted. Phoenix's approach to constructing Arthur's physicality drew from an eclectic range of influences. One of the most significant touchstones was Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp character, particularly as seen in Modern Times 1936, which informed both Arthur's overall demeanor and the deliberately awkward, exaggerated quality of his movements. Arthur's distinctive dance sequences were influenced by the physical performance style of dancer and actor Ray Bolger, while the gesture of forming a smile with two fingers pressed into his mouth was drawn from silent film legend Buster Keaton. In preparing physically for the role, Phoenix restricted himself to a single sparse meal per day for approximately 8 months, ultimately losing around 52 pounds in an effort to achieve a gaunt, malnourished appearance befitting the character. To refine Arthur's disturbing, involuntary laughter, a symptom associated with a real neurological condition known as pseudobulbar affect, Phoenix studied footage of real individuals who experience pathological laughing episodes. He deliberately avoided drawing on prior on-screen portrayals of the Joker for inspiration, wanting to create a character audiences could not easily categorize or relate to. Instead, he read material on the psychology behind real-world political assassinations in an effort to better understand the mindset of killers and what might drive someone towards such violence. Phillips has offered his own interpretation of the character's dual identity, describing Arthur's ordinary everyday face as functioning as his real mask, with the Joker persona representing his truer underlying self. Phillips has also noted that the film's final scene is the only moment depicting Arthur's genuinely unguarded laughter, Phillips has said he intentionally left ambiguous whether the film's Arthur Fleck ultimately becomes the same Joker familiar from mainstream Batman mythology, or instead inspires a separate figure who later adopts the same persona, though Phoenix himself has stated he personally believes Arthur is meant to be understood as that definitive character. The film's hair and makeup designers Nikki Lederman and Kay Giorgio aimed for a look that felt handmade and grounded in reality rather than stylized or theatrical. Giorgio conceived of Arthur as someone with visibly unwashed, neglected hair, reinforcing his socioeconomic circumstances and general state of self-neglect. Costume designer Mark Bridges, meanwhile, aimed for clothing that appeared aged, overdyed, and worn down, dressing Phoenix in inexpensive polyester trousers and an acrylic sweater to convey the character's poverty. Arthur's overall color palette was inspired by the broader visual aesthetic of the early 1980s, favoring blues, maroons, browns, mauves, and grays. Bridges has explained that Arthur's costuming choices were designed to start from what he described as a more juvenile register before gradually shifting to align with the film's darkening tone. In the opening scenes, for example, Arthur wears a hooded jacket that appears slightly too small alongside white socks, a combination meant to underscore a childlike quality reflective of his continued dependence on his mother Penny, who refers to him as my little boy, as well as a further nod to the influence of Chaplin's physical comedy tradition. Later in the film, during his interview with a social worker, Arthur instead wears a charcoal sweater before eventually appearing in what has been described as a scab-colored knit top during his time at Arkham State Hospital. A line of dialogue referencing an old suit Arthur has owned for years was interpreted visually through a mustard-toned vest paired with a patterned bottle green shirt. Once Arthur formally transforms into the Joker persona, his overall design shifts accordingly. His hair is dyed a shade of green that costume designers have informally described as broccoli green, and he dons a suit stylistically reminiscent of outfits worn in earlier, more traditional Batman-related media. Notably, however, the specific color scheme of this Joker suit differs from prior cinematic interpretations, favoring a mix of purple and either green or yellow rather than the more commonly depicted combinations from earlier films. Bridges has attributed this deliberate departure to Phillips's broader desire to avoid any visual connection to previous versions of the character. The suit's color was originally scripted as a shade of terracotta, but Bridges opted to shift it toward red instead, feeling that red conveyed a more emotionally expressive quality on screen. The character's overall wardrobe, combining green, yellow, purple, and red, was also designed to visually contrast with the cooler gray and blue tones associated with his antagonists, including Thomas Wayne, echoing the color scheme traditionally associated with Batman himself. The Joker's clown makeup, meanwhile, was designed to evoke a classic, somewhat antique quality, relying on darker tones and pronounced, menacing eyebrows. Letterman has noted that designing this makeup came with an unusual creative constraint, since existing copyright conventions hold that no two professional clown designs can be identical to one another, requiring extra care to ensure the film's version remained sufficiently distinct. Music Icelandic composer Hildur Guðnadóttir was brought on in August 2018 to score the film. She began composing after reading the finished screenplay and meeting directly with Phillips, who she said arrived with a number of strong, clearly formed ideas about how he envisioned the score sounding. Gudnadottir worked on the Joker score concurrently with her score for the acclaimed HBO miniseries Chernobyl, and she later told the Hindu's Divya Kala Bhavani that toggling between the two very different projects proved genuinely challenging given how tonally distinct the two scores were from one another. Beyond Gudnadottir's original orchestral work, the film's soundtrack also incorporates a handful of previously existing songs, including Frank Sinatra's That's Life, Send in the Clowns, Cream's White Room, and Rock and Roll Part 2. The inclusion of the latter track generated some controversy upon release, following initial reports suggesting that its performer, Gary Glitter, a convicted child sex offender, stood to receive royalty payments tied to the film's use of the song. Those reports were later clarified. Glitter would not, in fact, receive any royalties, having sold off the relevant rights long before the film's production. The song's current US rights are held by Universal Music Publishing Group. The film's official score was released separately on October 2, 2019 through Water Tower Music. Gudnadottir's work on the film went on to receive extensive industry recognition, earning her an Academy Award, a Satellite Award, a Saturn Award, a Hollywood Music in Media Award, and a Golden Globe Award for Best Original Score, the latter making her the first woman to win that Golden Globe category as a solo composer, Wesley's theatrical ahead of the film's release. Phillips built anticipation through a steady stream of behind the scenes and on-set photography posted to his personal Instagram account. On September 21, 2018, while filming was still underway, he released a short piece of test footage showing Phoenix fully in character and costume as the Joker, set to the song Laughing by the Guess Who. The first official trailer was unveiled at CinemaCon on April 2, 2019, before being released online to the general public the following day. That trailer prominently featured Smile, a song written by Charlie Chaplin and performed in this instance by Jimmy Durante, and it generated a broadly positive reaction from commentators, many of whom drew comparisons to earlier character-driven films such as Taxi Driver and Requiem for a Dream, 2000, while singling out Phoenix's performance for praise. Multiple outlets characterized the trailer as notably dark and gritty in tone and comic book. Com writer Jenna Anderson observed that it played more like a straightforward psychological thriller than a conventional comic book movie trailer. Actor Mark Hamill, well known among fans for voicing the Joker across various animated projects since the 1990 series Batman the Animated Series, publicly expressed his enthusiasm for the footage on social media. Not every reaction was quite so favorable, however. IO9's Germain Lucier felt the trailer withheld too much information and leaned too heavily on imagery similar to photos Phillips had already shared on Instagram, though he acknowledged the footage still hinted at real potential, even if he stopped short of calling it an outright triumph. The trailer reportedly drew more than 8 million views within just its first few hours online. A second wave of promotion followed several months later. On August 25, 2019, Phillips released a series of 6 brief teaser clips containing fragments of written text which served to announce that a full second trailer would arrive on August 28. Filmmaker Kevin Smith praised this second trailer, suggesting the film felt strong enough that it would work even if it existed entirely outside the DC Comics universe, and commending its overall originality. Deadline Hollywood later estimated that Warner Brothers spent in the neighborhood of $120 million on marketing and advertising for the film in total. Once the film reached theaters, the studio also took an unusual promotional tack of leaning into some of the more negative or provocative critical reactions the film had generated. Using that controversy itself as a marketing hook, Joker held its world premiere at the 76th Venice International Film Festival on August 31, 2019, where it received an 8-minute standing ovation from the audience in attendance and went on to win the festival's top prize, the Golden Lion. The film also screened at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 9, 2019. Its wide theatrical release followed on October 4, 2019 in the United States, distributed by Warner Brothers Pictures, with several international markets, including Australia, receiving the film a day earlier, in a somewhat unusual footnote to its release history. The film was screened at the White House for President Donald Trump on November 16, 2019, who reportedly enjoyed the film, honoring the filmmaker's original technical intentions. Some theaters presented the film using 70mm prints. Following a wave of awards nominations in the months after release, Warner Brothers also arranged for the film to be re-released across North American theaters beginning January 17, 2020. The film's release was not without controversy or concern regarding public safety. On September 18, 2019, the United States Army circulated an internal email warning service members about the possibility of violence at theaters screening the film, specifically referencing the character's popularity within online incel communities. A separate internal memo indicated that the Army had received what it described as credible information from law enforcement in Texas regarding a potential threat targeting an unspecified movie theater around the time of the film's release. Given the film's R rating, restricting admission for anyone under the age of 17 in the United States without adult accompaniment, some observers voiced concern that its content might inspire real-world imitation of the criminal acts it depicted. Despite these anxieties, Deadline Hollywood reported that both the FBI and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security ultimately found no credible threats specifically tied to the film's release. The discourse surrounding the film's tone also spilled into public exchanges involving the filmmaker themselves. In an interview with The Wrap, Phillips expressed surprise at the degree of criticism directed at the film's dark subject matter, suggesting that outrage itself functions as a kind of commodity in modern media, and characterizing some of the film's critics as coming from the far left politically. Separately, Phoenix walked out partway through an interview conducted by The Telegraph after being asked whether the film might inspire mass shooters. He eventually returned to complete the interview but declined to directly answer the question. In the aftermath of that incident, journalists were disinvited from the film's Los Angeles premiere at the TCL Chinese Theater, with only photographers permitted to interact with the cast and filmmakers on the red carpet. In a statement provided to Variety, Warner Bros. Suggested that enough had already been said about the film and that it was simply time for audiences to see it for themselves. Reflecting the sensitivity around the film's subject matter, it did not screen at the specific Aurora, Colorado theater where a mass shooting had occurred in 2012 during a screening of The Dark Knight Rises. 3 families connected to victims of that shooting, along with the mother of a witness, had specifically requested that the theater be excluded from the release. Separately, the landmark theater's chain barred moviegoers from wearing Joker-style costumes to screenings during the film's run, While police departments in both Los Angeles and New York City increased their visible presence around theaters, showing the film as a precaution, even though officials in both cities stated they had not received any specific credible threats. In the end, despite the considerable public anxiety leading up to release, screenings of the film proceeded without any reported violent incidents connected to its exhibition. Home media Joker became available for purchase on digital HD on December 17, 2019, followed by a physical media release on DVD Blu-ray and Ultra HD Blu-ray on January 7, 2020. The film later made its premium cable debut on HBO on May 16, 2020 and became available on the newly launched streaming service HBO Max. When that platform went live on May 27, 2020, reception box office Joker proved to be a considerable financial success, grossing approximately $330.5 million across the United States and Canada, alongside an additional $743.5 million from international markets, for a cumulative worldwide total of roughly $1.079 billion. This result placed it among the top grossing releases of 2019 overall and made it the second highest grossing R-rated film of all time at the point of its release. It also became the first R-rated film in history to cross the billion-dollar threshold worldwide, a distinction it held until Deadpool and Wolverine surpassed it in 2024. When measured by the ratio of budget to box office return, Joker additionally stands as the most profitable comic book-based film ever produced, a distinction owed to its comparatively small production budget, combined with unusually strong week-to-week box office holds throughout its theatrical run, a record that had previously belonged to 2016's Deadpool. Deadline Hollywood separately estimated that once all associated costs and revenues were fully accounted for, the film generated a net profit in the neighborhood of $437 million. In the lead up to release, industry box office forecasters offered a fairly wide range of predictions. In August 2019, Box Office Pro analyst Sean Robbins projected an opening weekend in the range of $60 to $90 million domestically. Following the film's festival premiere, that outlet's own tracking suggested a somewhat higher range of $70 to $95 million. Robbins later revised his estimate upward again to a range of $85 to $105 million, suggesting the film had a real chance of becoming the first October release ever to open above the $100 million mark, potentially surpassing the record then held by 2018's Venom. Not every analyst was quite as bullish. However, Comscore's senior media analyst Paul Dergarabedian anticipated an opening closer to $50 million, reasoning that the film did not fit the profile of a typical comic book blockbuster roughly 3 weeks before release. Official industry tracking pointed to a projected opening in the $65 to $80 million range, with some more optimistic estimates reaching as high as $90 million. In the days immediately preceding release, ticketing platform Atom Tickets reported that pre-sale figures for the film were outpacing those recorded for both Venom and It Chapter 2, which had opened to $91.1 million, and that Joker ranked as the platform's second best-selling R-rated title of 2019, trailing only John Wick. Chapter 3 Parabellum. Once released, the film opened in 374 theaters across North America and earned $39.9 million on its opening day alone, a total that included $13. $3 million from Thursday night preview screenings, figures that surpassed the previous October single-day record set by Venom. This also gave the film the single biggest October opening day of any release up to that point, eclipsing the mark previously set by 2018's Halloween. The film went on to post the biggest October opening weekend on record as well, finishing with a domestic total of $96.2 million. That result set individual career records for Phoenix, Phillips and De Niro alike, and stood as the fourth largest opening weekend ever recorded for an R-rated film, surpassing the earlier benchmark set by 2003's The Matrix Reloaded, while still trailing behind Deadpool 2 2018 and 2017. The opening also represented Warner Bros.' biggest domestic debut in a full 2 years. In its second weekend, the film's gross fell by a relatively modest 1.8%, bringing in $55.9 million while remaining in the top spot at the box office, a total that also marked the best second weekend performance ever recorded for an October release, surpassing the previous benchmark of $43.1 million set by Gravity back in 2013. The film continued to perform strongly in subsequent weeks, earning $29.2 million in its third weekend and $19.2 million in its fourth, finishing in second place behind Maleficent, Mistress of Evil on both occasions. After a theatrical run lasting 155 days, Joker's American theatrical release concluded on March 5, 2020, with a final domestic gross of $355.5 million, making it the fourth highest domestic total ever recorded for an R-rated film, trailing only The Passion of the Christ 2004, Deadpool, and American Sniper 2014. Internationally, pre-release forecasts anticipated an overseas debut in the range of roughly $155 million total, including approximately $75 million from an initial rollout across 73 territories. The film actually earned $5.4 million on its first day across 4 countries, followed by $18.7 million from 47 additional markets on its second day, for a combined 2-day international total of $24.6 million. From there, the film significantly exceeded early projections, ultimately earning $140. $5 million from international markets during its opening weekend, for a combined worldwide total of $234 million. Figures that made it the single biggest worldwide opening ever recorded for a film released in the month of October. Its strongest individual markets during that initial international run included South Korea, where its $16.3 million opening set a new record for Warner Bros. In that territory, followed by the United Kingdom at $14.8 million now, Mexico at $13.1 million now, and Japan at $7 million. The film's momentum continued in subsequent weeks. It added a further $125. $7 million internationally during its second weekend, and another $77.9 million in its third. By that point in its run, industry analysts had begun to anticipate that the film would ultimately become the highest grossing R-rated release of all time, with some speculating it could realistically finish its run above the $1 billion mark. The film officially became the highest grossing R-rated film ever during its fourth weekend of release, in which it added a further $47.8 million internationally, and it crossed the $1 billion threshold worldwide, roughly 1 month into its overall theatrical run. Critical response: Joker received what can broadly be described as a mixed critical reception overall, though this general classification obscures a considerable range of passionate responses on both ends of the spectrum. On the review aggregation website Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating of 68% based on 598 collected reviews, with an average score of 7.3 out of 10. The site's official critical consensus describes the film as delivering a chillingly plausible origin story for its infamous central character, framing it as both a showcase for its star and a notably dark evolution for comic book inspired cinema more broadly. Metacritic, which calculates a weighted average score, assigned the film a 59 out of 100 based on 60 critics, a figure the site characterizes as indicating mixed or average reviews. Audience reception, as measured through CinemaScore polling, was somewhat more favorable, with polled moviegoers awarding the film an average grade of B dots on that service's A plus to F scale. Separately, audiences surveyed by PostTrack gave the film an overall positive score of 84%, an average rating of 4 out of 5 stars, and a 60% definite recommend rating. Among the film's more enthusiastic reviewers, Mark Kermode of The Observer awarded the film 4 out of 5 stars, highlighting Joaquin Phoenix's intensely physical performance as one of the film's greatest assets. Writing for IGN, critic Jim Wedgwood awarded the film a perfect score, arguing that it would function compellingly as a character study, even stripped of its DC Comics connections, and describing its status as a genuinely strong entry in the broader Batman adjacent film canon as simply an added bonus. Wedgwood found the film to be a powerful and deeply unsettling allegory for contemporary societal neglect and violence, and he singled out Phoenix's performance as award-worthy. Also writing for The Observer, critic Sam Brooks likewise awarded the film a perfect score, describing it as gloriously daring and explosive, and praising the way Phillips synthesized influences from Scorsese's filmography into something that ultimately felt like an original creation in its own right. Variety critic Owen Gleiberman offered similarly strong praise, describing Phoenix's performance as genuinely astonishing and characterizing the film overall as a rare comic book movie that manages to meaningfully engage with real contemporary events and anxieties. Comicbook.com's Brandon Davis praised the film as a groundbreaking entry in the broader comic book adaptation genre, going so far as to suggest he found it more frightening than most traditional horror releases from that same year. Davis drew favorable comparisons to Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight from 2008 and praised both the film's cinematography and its performances, describing it as a work that essentially demanded to be seen firsthand to be properly understood. Deadline Hollywood's Pete Hammond argued that the film effectively redefines the character of the Joker altogether, describing it as a film that is nearly impossible to shake off after viewing, while also praising its narrative and performances and characterizing it as a piece of filmmaking that meaningfully speaks to the realities of the contemporary world in ways relatively few films manage to achieve. Peter Travers of Rolling Stone likewise offered enthusiastic praise, describing himself as nearly at a loss for words in trying to characterize Phoenix's performance, and calling the overall film both emotionally devastating and simply extraordinary. Not every review was quite so glowing, and a number of prominent critics offered more conflicted or outright negative assessments. David Ehrlich of IndieWire landed somewhere in the middle, awarding the film a C. grade, while he acknowledged that the film represented the boldest and most exciting entry in the superhero genre since The Dark Knight. He also characterized it as simultaneously incendiary, muddled, and potentially harmful in its messaging. Ehrlich predicted the film would likely satisfy longtime DC fans and praised Phoenix's central performance, but he was more critical of Phillips's overall direction and what he viewed as a general lack of originality in the underlying material. Glenn Kenny, writing for RogerEbert.com, awarded the film 2 out of 4 stars, although he praised the cast's performances and felt the basic story mechanics worked reasonably well Kenny was critical of the film's attempt at social commentary and of Philippa's directorial choices more broadly, describing the film as overly derivative of its influences and arguing that its ultimate priority seemed to lie less in genuine entertainment value than in generating a heightened self-important sense of its own significance. Writing for the entertainment outlet on Manorama, critic Sajesh Mohan offered a broader analysis of the character and argued that the film leaned heavily on familiar genre cliches, suggesting that Phoenix's performance stood as essentially the only genuinely original element within an otherwise formulaic production. Some of the harshest criticism came from Time magazine's Stephanie Zacharek, who delivered a firmly negative review and characterized Phoenix's performance as excessive and overwrought. She argued that while Phillips seemed to be attempting to comment meaningfully on cultural emptiness, the finished film instead ended up embodying that same emptiness rather than critiquing it. Zacharek further argued that the film's plot was essentially non-existent, describing its sense of darkness as adolescent in nature and criticizing what she viewed as an overreliance on shallow or for philosophical posturing. NPR critic Glenn Weldon offered a related critique, arguing that the film lacked genuine innovation and describing its attempt to generate sympathy for the Joker character as both unconvincing and, in his estimation, ultimately uninteresting. Weldon further suggested that the film's evident effort to distance itself stylistically from traditional comic book source material ultimately backfired, leaving it feeling more like an imitation of earlier films such as Taxi Driver than a genuinely distinct work in its own right. The Guardian's Peter Bradshaw was similarly unimpressed, going so far as to call it the most disappointing film of the year in his review. While he praised Phoenix's performance and found merit in the film's opening act, Bradshaw was critical of the film's handling of political and social themes as the story progressed, and he ultimately concluded that the film leaned too heavily on echoes of earlier Scorsese films rather than establishing a fully distinct identity of its own. Beyond traditional film critics, the movie also drew a considerable range of reactions from figures within the broader entertainment and creative industries. DC Comics chief creative officer Jim Lee praised the film as intense, raw and soulful, arguing that it remained true to the spirit of the character even while departing meaningfully from the established comic book source material. Mark Hamill, whose long history voicing the character in animation and video games dates back to the early 1990s, described the film as a brilliant reinvention of the Joker and offered his enthusiastic approval. Richard Donner, director of the original 1978 Superman film, called Joker brilliant, fascinating, and exceptionally well written, describing Phoenix's performance in the film as an act of genius. Documentary filmmaker Michael Moore went further still, describing the film as a cinematic masterpiece and suggesting it would pose a danger to society if audiences failed to see it. Actor Josh Brolin offered a more introspective response, suggesting that fully appreciating the film required either having personally experienced significant trauma or possessing a deep understanding of genuine compassion. Actor Vincent D'Onofrio publicly praised Phoenix's performance on social media, arguing that it deserved formal industry recognition, a sentiment echoed by actress Jessica Chastain, who called it one of the greatest pieces of acting she had ever witnessed. Actress and writer Phoebe Waller-Bridge similarly praised the film, suggesting that much of the public discomfort surrounding it stemmed from how uncomfortably authentic it felt. and speculating that the film would have generated far less anxiety had it been released a year into Barack Obama's presidency instead. Filmmaker David Fincher offered a somewhat more analytical reflection on the film's unexpected commercial and cultural success, suggesting that such an outcome would have seemed almost unthinkable had The Dark Knight not already proven the commercial viability of a similarly dark, grounded approach to the genre years earlier. He noted the seeming improbability of combining the sensibilities of Taxi Driver's Travis Bickle and the king of comedies Rupert Perkins into a single character study centered on mental illness, and having that combination go on to earn roughly $1 billion worldwide. Actor Brendan Gleeson described Phoenix's performance as utterly indelible and among the most impressive achievements he had personally witnessed in cinema, a reaction that reportedly played a direct role in his decision to join the film's eventual sequel. Director Ridley Scott, who had previously worked with Phoenix on 2000's Gladiator, said he was thoroughly impressed by the film. Although he expressed some discomfort with what he perceived as its apparent glorification of violence, he nonetheless felt Phoenix's performance was remarkable enough to make him a genuinely valuable asset, both artistically and commercially, for Scott's own later film 2023's Napoleon. The film's cultural resonance also extended into broader academic and social commentary. Discussions of the film frequently centered on its handling of mental illness and the character's psychological and sociological portrayal, while some commentators drew connections between the film's depiction of the Joker and patterns commonly associated with real-world mass shooters, as well as members of online incel communities. The Guardian's Christina Newland offered a more nuanced take, arguing that while Arthur Fleck himself should not necessarily be understood as an incel, members of that particular online subculture were nonetheless likely to see something of themselves reflected in his character. Several critics, including Voivoda, Hammond, and Newland, interpreted the film primarily as a cautionary tale, suggesting its core message centers on the idea that a society which callously disregards its most vulnerable members risks ultimately producing individuals capable of Joker-like violence in response. Writing for the Washington Examiner, Stephen Kent similarly described Arthur Fleck as a composite figure drawing on shared characteristics of real mass shooters, framing the film's underlying message as a sobering reminder that society continues to produce men susceptible to the same pressures depicted on screen. Chauncey K. Robinson, writing for People's World, described the film as walking a delicate line between simply exploring and potentially validating the Joker's worldview, ultimately characterizing it as a pointed examination of a fundamentally broken social system that inadvertently creates its own monsters. Other commentators expressed more direct concern that the film's evidently sympathetic portrayal of a violent, mentally troubled protagonist might risk inspiring real-world imitation. Richard Lawson of Vanity Fair argued that the film should extend an excessive degree of sympathy toward a particular archetype, white man who commit horrific acts of violence, suggesting that the ideological undercurrents depicted in the film mapped uncomfortably well onto real individuals responsible for mass shootings and similarly extreme acts of violence, and that such figures are sometimes granted an almost mythic quality by society in the aftermath of their crimes as people search for explanations. Jim Grady of National Review voiced a related worry, expressing concern that a subset of angry, emotionally unstable young men might watch Phoenix's character descend into violent retribution against society and come away feeling as though the film uniquely understood and validated their own grievances. Not every commentator shared this concern, however. Writing in Mere Orthodoxy, Michael Schindler offered a contrasting psychoanalytic perspective, drawing on the theoretical work of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan to argue that the film's sympathetic wish fulfillment fantasy might actually function as a kind of pressure release valve, potentially diffusing real world violence rather than encouraging it by allowing troubled viewers to experience catharsis vicariously rather than through actual violent acts. The film also drew commentary from mental health professionals, given its close attention to Arthur's psychological state. British neurocriminologist Adrian Raine expressed admiration for how accurately the film depicted the underlying psychology of a murderer, telling Vanity Fair that he considered it a genuinely useful educational tool and indicating he intended to incorporate clips from the film into his own academic teaching. Psychiatrist Kamran Ahmed highlighted specific elements of Arthur's backstory, including parental abuse, personal loss, and a family history of mental illness, as plausible contributing factors in the development of his condition as depicted on screen. American psychiatrist Imani Walker, known in part for her work with the Bravo television series Married to Medicine Los Angeles, and for her broader clinical experience working with violent individuals affected by mental illness, offered a sympathetic reading of Arthur's arc, noting that the character does make genuine attempts to seek help before his eventual downfall, only to find himself repeatedly failed and abandoned by the systems meant to support him. Not every clinical perspective was so favorable. However, forensic psychiatrist Zeev Cohen criticized the film for what he viewed as a misleading conflation of psychopathy characterized clinically by a lack of conscience, with mental illness more broadly, arguing that this conflation risked reinforcing an inaccurate and stigmatizing public perception that equates mental illness with inherent dangerousness. Some commentators focus specifically on the film's engagement with economic and political themes. Micah Uetret, managing director of the socialist magazine Jacobin, wrote in a piece published by The Guardian that he was genuinely surprised much of the mainstream media coverage failed to register what he considered the film's fairly direct critique of American austerity policy, specifically its portrayal of how abandoning vulnerable populations with the broader society ultimately produces devastating consequences for the Uetrit went on to characterize the world depicted in the film as one that has effectively collapsed into a form of social barbarism, and he expressed some surprise that these themes, which he considered relatively unsubtle, had not been more widely discussed in press coverage of the film. Ahmed similarly pointed to the film's implicit commentary on chronically underfunded mental health services as an important, if understated, element of its broader social critique. Writing for Vulture Critic, Alison Wilmot took a somewhat different tack, describing the film's overall political stance as fundamentally contradictory and, in places, essentially incoherent. For his part, Phillips has consistently maintained that Joker was never intended as an overtly political film. He has, however, engaged repeatedly with public discourse surrounding the film's themes, at times pushing back directly against critics who raised concerns about its portrayal of violence. He has questioned why sparking broader public discussion about violence and its causes should necessarily be viewed as a negative outcome of the film's release. Reflecting more broadly on the political backlash the film generated, Phillips remarked on what he saw as an unusual convergence in rhetoric, observing that criticism from the political left could, in his view, sometimes sound remarkably similar to criticism coming from the far right when it served a particular argument, a dynamic he described as genuinely eye-opening for him personally. The film's cultural footprint extended well beyond conventional film criticism and into real-world political and social movements. During an October 2019 event tied to Italy's five-star movement, comedian and politician Beppe Grillo delivered a speech while wearing Joker-style makeup. In 2021, Yusuke Kawai, a candidate for governor of Japan's Chiba Prefecture, appeared on the national broadcaster NHK dressed in a Joker costume. References to the character surfaced repeatedly in anti-government protest movements around the world during this period. During Lebanon's 17 October Revolution, a graffiti collective known as Ashem painted a mural depicting the Joker holding a Molotov cocktail, and reports indicated that a Joker-themed face painting station was set up amid protests in Beirut. In Los Angeles, Chile, during the country's social outburst protests, demonstrators wrote the phrase, "We are all clowns," a line drawn directly from the film's depiction of Gotham City protesters at the base of a public statue. In Hong Kong, protesters pushing back against an emergency decree that banned the wearing of masks incorporated Joker masks, among other fictional character masks, as a means of challenging the restriction. In France, firefighters participating in the Yellow Vest protests were photographed wearing Joker-style makeup while holding protest placards. In 2020, amid the George Floyd protests in the United States, Argentine President Alberto Fernandez drew a public comparison between images from those protests and scenes from the film. The film's shooting locations have also taken on a life of their own in popular culture. A particular staircase in the Bronx used during filming has since become widely known as the Joker Stairs, evolving into both a tourist destination and a recurring subject of internet memes, with visitors frequently recreating Arthur's iconic dance sequence from the film at the site. In the world of sports, Ukrainian boxing champion Alexander Usyk wore a suit visually referencing the Joker's costume during a pre-fight press conference ahead of his bout against Anthony Joshua. Looking back on the film with some critical distance, Deadline Hollywood included Joker on a 2020 list, ranking the 21 most influential films of the 21st century so far, with writer Pete Hammond describing it as a film that managed to emerge from comic book origins to become a genuinely unsettling reflection of contemporary anxieties, demonstrating that the broader genre was capable of being taken far more seriously than many had previously assumed. Empire magazine similarly ranked the film 39th on its list of the 100 greatest movies of the 21st century, crediting it with representing a further, more mature evolution of the modern comic book movie, and with proving that DC's cinematic properties could thrive as standalone works outside a tightly interconnected shared universe structure of the kind favored by Marvel Studios. The film's cultural relevance has continued to surface in real-world contexts well after its initial release. Following the fatal shooting of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in 2024, numerous commentators drew comparisons to the film, particularly regarding the way the alleged shooter, Luigi Mangione, was embraced by segments of the public, following long simmering public frustration with the American healthcare system. A dynamic some observers likened to the public's reaction to the deaths of Murray Franklin and Thomas Wayne at the hands of Arthur Fleck and his followers within the film's own narrative. In a more troubling instance of the film's seemingly inspiring real-world imitation, a man in Japan was sentenced in 2023 to 23 years in prison for stabbing a fellow train passenger, in an act that authorities determined was directly modeled on the film's subway sequence, in which Arthur kills the three Wayne Investments employees who had harassed him. Although Joker was originally conceived and marketed as a self-contained standalone film with no plans for a sequel, Warner Bros. Ultimately moved forward with a follow-up project regardless. That sequel, titled Joker Folie à Deux, brought back both Phoenix and Beetz in their original roles and added Lady Gaga to the cast in the role of Harley Quinn. It was released on October 4, 2024, exactly 5 years after the original film's theatrical debut, but was met with negative critical reviews and a notably weak commercial performance, standing in sharp contrast to the critical and financial success achieved by its predecessor.